They laughed at the veteran for the strange farm he was building on the lonely hill with his loyal dog, calling it Elias Thorne's Molehole, a monument to madness. But one day, his German shepherd, Bear, stopped at a sealed iron door deep in the earth and refused to leave, as if he sensed something ancient and hidden was waiting on the other side. And when the great blizzard the valley never saw coming finally struck, the place they all mocked became the only thing keeping every last one of them alive. What did the dog uncover in the dark? And what did the quiet man know that everyone else had forgotten? We invite you to like this story, comment where you're watching from, and stay with us until the very end to see how a man the world wrote off became the one who saved it. Elias Thorne lived on the north-facing slope of Whisperwind Ridge, in a valley so remote it felt like a secret kept by the mountains themselves. His only companion was Bear, a German shepherd whose sable coat was the color of the deep woods, and whose eyes held a steady, knowing calm. Elias was a quiet man in his late 40s, with the disciplined economy of movement that comes from a life where wasted effort is a liability. He had come back from his time in the Navy with little to say about it, buying the plot of land his father had once owned and setting to work on a project that baffled the good people down in the town of Covenant Creek. He wasn't building a house in the way most men do. Instead, he spent his days shoring up the entrance to an old, abandoned silver mine that honeycombed the granite heart of the ridge. He hauled timber up the steep track in his old pickup, each beam carried on his shoulder with a patient strength that seemed to defy its weight. He didn't just reinforce the entrance. He drove his work deep into the mountain, following the old tunnels, his headlamp a solitary star in the profound dark. Down in the earth, he had built a place of impossible life. He had found where the mountain breathed, tapping into geothermal vents that sighed a constant, humid warmth into the cold rock. This was his heat, a gentle and unending supply that kept the deepest chambers at a steady 65 degrees, even when the world outside was frozen solid. For water, he had followed a trickle of seepage to its source, a pristine underground spring that flowed from an aquifer deep within the granite. He'd spent a month building a gravity-fed irrigation system, a network of carefully graded pipes and channels that carried the pure, cold water to tiered hydroponic beds he had constructed from salvaged steel and timber. And for light, he had harnessed the creek that ran down his property, building a small but efficient micro-hydro generator that powered banks of full-spectrum grow lamps. Under their artificial sun, rows of kale, potatoes, tomatoes, and beans grew in defiance of the darkness, a lush, green secret hidden from the sky. Bear was his constant shadow in this work, a silent partner. The dog would lie for hours on a canvas bed just inside the lamplight, his head on his paws, watching Elias with an unwavering focus. He was not a pet in the conventional sense. He was a partner, a guardian who rarely barked, but whose low growl was an unmistakable signal. He moved with the same quiet purpose as the man he followed, his presence a steady, warm weight against the immense silence of the mountain. In the small, Spartan cabin Elias had built near the mine entrance, there was little of personal value save for a worn bookshelf. On it sat not books of leisure, but manuals on geology, cold-weather agriculture, and structural engineering. And at the very back of the furthest, warmest chamber of his underground farm, set into a wall of solid rock, was a heavy, sealed iron door, its surface pitted with age. It had no visible handle or lock, only 4 massive rusted hinges. His father had told him stories about it, a vague warning from his childhood to leave it be. It was the one part of the mountain Elias had not yet touched, a final mystery he honored with a respectful distance. The people of Covenant Creek meant no real harm, but they were a practical folk who measured a man by the sense his work made. And Elias Thorne's work made no sense at all. They saw him in town once every few weeks, his old Ford truck loaded with bags of soil nutrients, copper wire, PVC piping, and whatever other strange supplies he required. He'd park in front of Sarah Albright's general store, Bear sitting sentinel in the passenger seat, and go about his business with a polite nod and few words. The mockery usually started after he'd gone, most often at the tavern, led by Hank Jessup. Hank was a third-generation rancher with a booming voice and a face weathered red by the wind and his own loud opinions. "Saw the mole man in town today?" Hank would announce, leaning against the bar. "Stocking up to grow his magic beans underground, I suppose. A man who's afraid of the sun, I tell you." The other men would laugh, their amusement easy and unthinking. They called it Elias's folly, or the bunker, imagining him as a paranoid doomsday prepper, hiding from a world that had left him behind. They were good people, but they lived in the day-to-day, their concerns tied to the price of beef, the health of their herds, and the chance of rain. The idea of a man spending his life digging into a cold mountain for anything other than silver was the height of foolishness. They couldn't see the warmth he was cultivating, only the darkness he was entering. Only Sarah Albright, the quiet widow who ran the general store, never joined in the laughter. She had lost her husband to a sudden illness a decade prior, and understood that some people carry their reasons deep inside, where the world can't see them. When Elias came to her counter, she would simply tally his purchases, her gaze direct and respectful. "Looks like you're staying busy up there, Elias," she'd say, her voice gentle. "Keeping busy," he would reply, and that was the extent of their conversation. But in that small exchange, a current of mutual understanding passed between them. She saw not paranoia, but purpose. She didn't know what it was, but she recognized its weight. The rest of the town, however, saw only waste. They saw a veteran who could have been a valuable part of their community, a strong back, a disciplined mind, squandering his time on a hole in the ground. They'd watch his truck rumble back up the winding dirt road toward his ridge, shaking their heads. "Oh, he won't last," Hank would often declare with finality. "One hard winter, and he'll come down from that hill for good." Back on the ridge, Elias was indifferent to their opinions. He had his work, and he had Bear. And sometimes, at the end of a long day, he would stand before the sealed iron door at the back of the mine, the lamplight casting long shadows across its rusted face. He'd run a hand over the cold metal, feeling the deep, resonant hum of the mountain behind it. It was a promise or a warning left by his father, and the weight of it was far more real to him than the laughter from the valley below. Elias's discipline was not born of fear, but of experience. He had been a Navy SEAL, specializing in cold weather operations, a life that had stripped away every shred of illusion about the thin veneer of comfort that separates order from chaos. He had learned in the frozen dark of the Arctic and the high altitudes of hostile mountains that preparation was not a hobby. It was a form of faith. It was the quiet, solitary work you did so that others might have a chance when things went wrong. He didn't speak of it, didn't wear it as a badge of honor. It was simply part of him now, like the scar above his eye or the stillness in his hands. But the deeper reason for his work on the mountain came from his father, a geologist who had been as quiet and misunderstood as Elias himself. His father had seen the world not in years, but in epochs. He spoke of deep climate cycles, of great winters that had scoured this very valley centuries ago, leaving their mark in the rock strata and the ancient rings of bristlecone pines. He believed the valley's memory was short, its comfort a temporary grace. "Stetinana, the mountain remembers," he used to say, "even if the people forget." For months, Elias had honored his father's old warning about the iron door. But Bear changed that. The dog, who never acted without reason, became singularly focused on it. He would sit before the door for hours, whining low in his throat. Then he began to scratch at its base, the sound echoing in the deep quiet. He refused to be called away, planting his feet, his gaze fixed on the immovable barrier. He would look back at Elias, a clear and urgent question in his intelligent eyes. For a week, Elias tried to ignore it, but the dog's insistence was too profound, too out of character to dismiss. Finally, Elias relented. "All right, boy," he murmured, resting a hand on Bear's head. "Let's see what has you so concerned." Opening the door was a monumental task. There was no keyhole, no handle. He studied the seams, realizing it was sealed not with a lock, but with pressure and rust. It took him 3 days with heavy-duty jacks, pry bars, and a half-gallon of penetrating oil. With a final, groaning shriek of tortured metal, the door swung inward into absolute blackness. The air that rolled out was not foul, but cool and dry, smelling of old canvas and preserved wood. Holding a lantern high, Elias stepped through with Bear at his side. He was not in a mine tunnel. He was in a vast, finished cavern, its walls reinforced with thick, creosoted timbers and its floor perfectly level. It was a shelter, twice the size of the farm he had built, and it was fully supplied. Crates of canned goods were stacked neatly against one wall, barrels of what smelled like kerosene against another. There were tools, seeds in sealed tins, and blankets packed in cedar chests. At the far end of the chamber sat a simple wooden desk. On it, a leather-bound journal and a sealed envelope with his name, Elias, written in his father's familiar hand. He sat down and read the letter. "My son," it began, "if you are reading this, it means you listen to the mountain and not to the valley. I am not a man of many words, as you know, but I put my life's work here. My geological studies showed me what is coming. Not a storm, not a bad winter, but a shift, a return to a cycle the modern world has forgotten. The geothermal vents will keep this place warm. The spring will provide the water. I have left you enough to start. This place is not a tomb, Elias. It is an ark. Your work is not to hide, but to hold, to be the steward of this refuge when it is needed. I did not have the strength to finish it, but you do. This is your inheritance. Not the land, but the responsibility. Be the man the mountain needs you to be." Elias sat in the silent, dust-filled room, the letter in his hand, and understood everything. His father's eccentricity, his own quiet compulsions. It wasn't paranoia. It was a legacy, a sacred duty passed from one generation to the next. Bear rested his heavy head on Elias's knee, his purpose fulfilled, and together they sat in the stillness, the weight of the mountain around them like a promise. In the weeks that followed, a change began to settle over the valley, so subtle at first that only a man who watched closely would notice. Elias, his purpose now sharpened by his father's letter, saw the signs everywhere. The squirrels, usually frantic and chattering as autumn deepened, grew quiet. Their frantic hoarding finished a month early. He saw them sealing the entrances to their nests with mud and pine pitch, a behavior only seen before the very harshest of winters. The high-altitude pines on the ridge, the tough, wind-scoured ones that clung to the granite peaks, began to drop their needles in golden showers, conserving energy long before the first frost was due. The sky, too, held a different quality. The blues were paler, washed out, and the sunsets had a strange, greenish tint at their edges, a sign of unusual particulates high in the atmosphere. The air pressure felt heavy, dense, pressing down on the valley in a way that made the silence feel deeper, more profound. The townspeople of Covenant Creek noticed none of it. They talked of the mild autumn, of the beautiful, clear days, glad for the extended season to get their work done. They saw the pale sky and called it pretty. They saw the quiet forests and called it peaceful. Elias began to work with a new, focused intensity. He wasn't just maintaining his farm anymore. He was preparing the ark. He cleared the dust from his father's hidden shelter, took inventory of the decades-old supplies, most of which were still viable, and integrated the space with his own. He ran piping from the spring into the larger cavern, establishing a secondary water source. He wired a circuit from his hydro generator to power a few simple lights in the deep shelter, their warm glow pushing back the ancient dark. He doubled his own supplies, making more frequent, heavier trips to Sarah's store. He bought salt, flour, sugar, yeast, and medical supplies, packing them away with quiet efficiency. Sarah watched him, her brow furrowed with a gentle concern. "Expecting a long winter, Elias?" she asked one afternoon as he loaded the last of 50-pound sacks of flour into his truck. "The worst," he said, his voice low and certain. It was the most definitive statement he had ever made to her, and she did not question it. That same week, an old, solitary trapper named Silas, who lived in a cabin so high on the mountain he was more rumor than man, came down for his yearly supplies. He was a whisper of a man, with a face like a dried apple and eyes that had seen 90 winters come and go. He found Elias outside the store and stopped, leaning on his hickory staff. He sniffed the air, his gaze turning to the high peaks. "The mountain's holding its breath, son," Silas rasped, his voice thin as a reed. "Ain't seen it like this since I was a boy. The big cold is coming, the kind that breaks things." He nodded once, a confirmation passing between the two men who knew how to listen to the earth, and then shuffled on his way. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air temperature. It was the deep, resonant certainty of nature's turning. Bear felt it too. The dog grew restless, patrolling the perimeter of the cabin with a stiff, watchful gait. He would often stop and stare down at the twinkling lights of the town in the valley below, a low whine escaping his throat, a sound of profound and instinctual worry. The blizzard did not arrive. It fell. One moment, the sky was a sheet of flat, gray metal. The next, the world was gone, erased by a vertical torrent of white. It came with a sound that was not wind, but a deep, pressurized roar, the sound of the upper atmosphere collapsing onto the valley. Snow didn't drift down. It hammered the earth in dense, blinding waves. Within the first hour, 6 feet had fallen. Within 3, the roads were impassable, and the power lines, heavy with ice, snapped with reports like rifle shots, plunging Covenant Creek into a sudden, shocking darkness. The cold that came with the storm was a living thing. It was a predatory cold, ancient and absolute. The kind of cold that found every crack, every weakness, and broke it. The temperature dropped past 0, past 10 below, past 30. It settled at a number the valley had never known. A temperature that turned diesel fuel to gel and made exposed skin freeze solid in seconds. The town's defenses, built for ordinary winters, failed catastrophically. Propane heaters couldn't keep up, their tanks freezing over. Wood stoves, burning through seasoned cords at an alarming rate, offered a shrinking circle of warmth while the rest of the house became an icebox. Pipes that had never frozen before burst in walls with explosive force. The town's backup generator at the community hall sputtered and died, its fuel line frozen solid. Up on Whisperwind Ridge, Elias and Bear were safe in the heart of the mountain. The storm's fury was a distant, muffled drumbeat, the rage of a world they were no longer truly in. Elias stood for a time in his small, heavily reinforced cabin above ground, looking out a triple-paned window. He could see nothing but a churning vortex of white. The wind shrieked, tearing at the roof, but the heavy beams he had set held firm. He felt the cabin shudder and knew it was time to go below. Down in the farm, the air was warm and humid, smelling of damp earth and growing things. The geothermal vents sighed their steady, gentle heat. The grow lamps cast a vibrant, peaceful light over the rows of green plants. The water from the spring trickled through the pipes with a calm, meditative sound. It was a pocket of summer, a stubborn defiance of the deathly winter that had consumed the world outside. He checked the gauges on the generator, the flow of the water systems, the temperature in the deep shelter. Everything was holding. Everything was ready. Bear lay at his feet, calm now that they were in their sanctuary, though his ears still twitched at the faint, deep vibrations of the storm raging far above. Elias made a simple meal of baked potatoes and fresh greens from his garden, sharing a portion with the dog. He sat on a wooden bench, listening to the quiet hum of his systems, a lonely guardian in his hidden ark, and waited. He knew, with a heavy and certain heart, that it was only a matter of time before the people from the valley started to climb his hill. For 3 days, the world remained frozen and silent. Elias imagined the growing desperation in the valley, the dwindling fires, the creeping, relentless cold. He knew the pride of the people in Covenant Creek, their stubborn self-reliance. They would hold out as long as they could. But a storm like this wasn't a test of pride. It was a force of nature that stripped everything down to the simple, brutal need for warmth. On the 4th day, he saw it. A single, struggling headlight beam, bobbing and weaving through the blizzard, slowly making its way up his private road. The engine whined, fighting for every foot of ground against the deep snow. Finally, it stalled 100 yards from his cabin. A figure emerged, hunched against the wind, and began to trudge through the waist-deep drifts. It was Hank Jessup. When he reached the cabin door, he was covered in snow, his face a mask of ice and desperation. He was no longer the loud, confident rancher from the tavern. He was a man broken by the cold, his usual bluster scoured away. He could barely speak, his words choked by shivering. "Thorn," he gasped, his breath pluming in the frigid air. My family, the truck, no more fuel, we're freezing." He gestured back toward the dark shape of his stalled pickup, where his wife and 2 small children were huddled. Elias simply nodded, pulling on his heavy coat. "Stay here," he said, his voice calm and even. "Get warm." He left Hank stumbling toward the wood stove in the cabin and went out into the storm with Bear at his heels. He carried blankets and a heavy-duty tow strap. It took him nearly an hour to winch the truck the rest of the way up the hill and get the family inside the cabin. Hank's wife Mary clutched her children, her face pale with fear and relief. Her eyes, when she looked at Elias, were filled with a gratitude so profound it needed no words. Elias gave them hot broth and pointed them toward the mine entrance. "It's warm down there," he said. "Safer." Hank hesitated, his pride warring with his fear. He looked at the dark opening, the place he had mocked for years. Then he looked at his shivering daughter. "Thank you," he whispered, the words seeming to cost him a great deal. He followed Elias down the ramp into the earth. The moment the warm, humid air of the farm washed over them, their expressions changed from fear to utter disbelief. They stared at the glowing lights, the impossible green of the gardens, the quiet, orderly space. It was like stepping into another world. Hank looked around, then back at Elias, his eyes wide with the dawning realization of just how wrong he had been. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came. Elias simply showed them to a dry, warm section of his father's cavern, laid out with clean blankets. "Rest," he said, before turning to go back to the surface. He knew they wouldn't be the last. Over the next 24 hours, they came. First in trickles, then in a steady, stumbling procession. The Martins, whose propane tank had run dry. The Garcias, whose roof had partially collapsed under the weight of the snow. Old Man Hemlock, the town's retired doctor, who had nearly succumbed to hypothermia in his drafty house. Soon, the entire population of Covenant Creek, some 40 souls, were making their way up the hill to Elias's folly. He met each family with the same quiet competence, leading them out of the biting cold and into the sanctuary he had prepared. There were no questions, no recriminations, He simply opened his door and let them in. Bear moved among the newcomers, a silent, watchful presence. He would sniff each person gently, then, seeming to sense their fear and exhaustion, would lean against a crying child or rest his head on the lap of an elderly woman, offering his steady, canine comfort. The people were awestruck by what they found underground. The scale of it, the sheer, brilliant foresight, was beyond anything they could have imagined. They walked through the glowing gardens and the vast, supplied shelter his father had built, their faces a mixture of wonder and shame. The blizzard raged on for 8 full days. Inside the mountain, a new kind of community began to form, forged in the warm, lamp-lit dark. The initial shock gave way to a quiet, shared purpose. People who had known each other their whole lives but had only ever exchanged pleasantries now worked side by side. Sarah Albright, with her calm demeanor and practical mind, began organizing the food supplies, creating a makeshift kitchen and rationing out the preserved goods from Elias's father's cache and the fresh vegetables from the garden. The men, led by a humbled and deeply respectful Hank Jessup, formed teams to check the structural timbers, clear any minor rockfalls, and help Elias maintain the water and power systems. The women cared for the children, turning a corner of the cavern into a play area, their gentle voices a soft murmur against the deep silence of the rock. On the 3rd day of their shared confinement, Hank Jessup found Elias checking the hydroponic pumps. The big rancher stood awkwardly for a moment, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands. "Elias," he said, his booming voice reduced to a quiet rasp. "I need to say something." Elias stopped his work and turned to face him, his expression patient. "I was wrong about you," Hank said, finally meeting his eyes. "About all of this. I laughed. I called it your molehole. I was a fool, a loud, arrogant fool. What you've done here, what your father did. You saved us. All of us. And I am truly, deeply sorry." It was not a grand speech, but a plain, heartfelt confession, and it hung in the warm air with immense weight. Elias simply nodded. "We all do what we have to, Hank," he replied. "Now, can you give me a hand with this valve?" In that moment, the mockery of the past was washed away, replaced by the simple, shared reality of the work at hand. The act of accepting help was Elias's forgiveness, and the act of giving it was Hank's penance. The unwanted, misunderstood shelter had become their ark, and inside it, the people of Covenant Creek were becoming a community in a way they had never been before. When the storm finally broke, the silence it left behind was absolute. The people emerged from the mine into a world transformed, a landscape of impossible, sculptural white. The sun on the snow was blinding. The valley below was buried, pristine and still, the houses looking like small, frosted mounds. They had lost much. Barns had collapsed. Livestock had frozen. The town itself would need immense repair, but as they took a head count in the brilliant, cold sunshine, a staggering realization dawned on them. Against all odds, every single person had survived. Not one soul from Covenant Creek had been lost to the great blizzard. Their salvation was owed entirely to the quiet man and his dog, to the foresight of a father long gone, and to the hidden farm they had all dismissed as madness. The rebuilding of the town was different from any that had come before. It was not just a reconstruction of buildings, but a remaking of their entire way of life. They did not mock Elias's methods anymore. They sought them out. He became their teacher, their quiet center. He showed them how to reinforce their homes against heavy snow loads, how to build root cellars that would not freeze, how to create small, geothermal-assisted greenhouses. The work that had once isolated him now connected him to everyone. Hank Jessup became his most devoted student, his natural leadership now channeled into ensuring the town would never be so vulnerable again. They built a communal shelter, larger and more robust, powered by a new, bigger hydro generator, its design based entirely on Elias's system. One man's foresight became their shared wisdom. Years passed. The valley thrived, its people bound by the memory of the great blizzard and the quiet resilience they had learned. Elias Thorne grew older, the lines on his face deepening, his hair turning the color of winter frost. Bear aged alongside him, his powerful stride shortening to a gentle shuffle, his muzzle a soft, snowy white. The old dog spent his days sleeping in the sun by the cabin door or resting his head on Elias's knee, his duty done. One autumn morning, as the first chill touched the air, Elias passed away peacefully in his sleep. The whole town mourned him, not with loud ceremony, but with a deep, quiet reverence. They buried him on the ridge, overlooking the valley he had saved. They did not erect a grand monument. Instead, they placed a single, large, smooth river stone at the entrance to the farm. Carved into its surface were simple words, "Elias Thorne, he kept us warm." The farm, his father's ark, became a sacred trust, maintained by the community, a living legacy of the quiet veteran who had listened to the mountain. The strange, solitary work of a man the town had misunderstood, a duty revealed by the loyalty of his dog, had become the very thing that saved them all, a quiet love that outlived the man who built it, a testament to the idea that sometimes the ones the world overlooks are the very guardians placed there to protect it. And so, the story of Elias Thorne and his dog Bear became a quiet legend in that valley, a reminder whispered on cold winter nights. It speaks to a truth we often forget in our busy, noisy world, that the most important work is often done in silence, without applause. It is the steady, patient preparation, the quiet act of faith in the face of uncertainty. It is the wisdom of listening to the earth, to the animals, to the faint echoes of those who came before us. Elias was seen as an outsider, a man living in the past, but he was actually living for the future, for a moment he knew would come, a moment no one else was willing to see. It's a story about how the deepest strength is often found not in loud pronouncements, but in quiet duty. It asks us to look again at the people our world might be quick to dismiss, the quiet ones, the different ones, the ones who walk a solitary path. Perhaps they are not lost. Perhaps they are building an ark, tending a hidden garden, keeping a silent watch. Perhaps they are the keepers of a warmth we will all one day need. We hope this story has brought a little warmth to you today. We invite you to share it with someone who might need to hear it, and to tell us your own thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for being with us. May you be blessed, and may you always find shelter from the storm.